The soft hum of engines filled the cabin as the plane waited on the runway, its rows of seats packed with passengers ready to fly north. It was an early morning flight from Denver to Anchorage, one of those trips that carried a mix of business travelers, families, and quiet wanderers chasing their own reasons for being in the sky. In seat 20D sat a woman who didn't quite look like she belonged to any of those groups. She looked ordinary enough at first glance. Dark jacket, hair tied back, a simple travel bag under the seat. She scrolled through her phone for a moment, then set it aside and stared out the small oval window. The reflection of her face in the glass was calm, but her eyes carried that steady, focused look of someone who'd spent years reading clouds and horizons, not as scenery but as signals. Her name was Alyssa Turner, and though no one on the plane knew it, she was one of the very few women who had ever flown an F-22 Raptor. Today, though, she was just another passenger in seat 20D. Alyssa had taken hundreds of flights before, sometimes in the cockpit, sometimes in the back, like this one. She didn't love commercial travel. It always felt slow and crowded compared to the precise rhythm of the Air Force. But she didn't mind it either. She had learned to enjoy the stillness it offered, the space to think without radio chatter or the pull of gravity pressing on her shoulders. The flight attendants moved through the aisle, checking seat belts and overhead bins. One of them, a young man with an easy smile, stopped near her row. "Morning, ma'am. Can I take that bag for you?" She looked up and smiled politely. "Thanks, but I've got it. It's light." He nodded and went on, probably forgetting her face within seconds, as most people did. She liked that. Being unnoticed gave her peace. As the aircraft started to taxi, Alyssa leaned her head back. Outside the window, the Colorado sky was still pale with dawn. The mountains sat in the distance, brushed with snow. For a moment she thought about her last flight in uniform, the rush of wind, the crackling radio, the deep growl of the Raptor's engines. She could almost feel the G-forces again, the way they pushed against her bones when she rolled into a steep turn. It wasn't nostalgia exactly, more like muscle memory. Her body remembered the sky even when her mind didn't try to. The intercom clicked. "Good morning, folks," the pilot's voice came through, steady and friendly. "We're cleared for takeoff. Weather looks good all the way to Anchorage. A little bit of crosswind along the coast, but nothing major. Sit back and enjoy the ride." Alyssa smiled faintly. The words were routine, but they carried a certain comfort. The cabin grew quiet as the engines roared to life, pushing the plane forward with a deep vibration that pulsed through her chest. She closed her eyes for a second and took a breath. When the nose lifted, she felt that familiar moment, weight giving way to flight. It never got old. As they climbed, the sunlight hit the windows in streaks of gold. People reached for shades, others took photos. The man in the aisle seat next to her, probably mid-30s wearing headphones, grinned and said, "Still amazes me every time, doesn't it?" Alyssa turned to him, nodded. "It does," he chuckled. "You fly much?" She hesitated for just a moment. "A bit," she said simply. He didn't notice the small truth hidden in those two words. After a while, the cabin settled into its rhythm, the clinking of cups, pages turning, quiet talk. Alyssa opened a small notebook she carried everywhere, flipping to a blank page. She didn't write much, just a few scattered words, numbers, headings, small sketches of flight paths. It was a habit she'd never shaken. Sometimes she'd jot down the details of the weather, or the way the wind shifted over certain mountain ranges. To anyone else, it might look like random notes. To her, it was instinct. She was tracing the shape of a cloud formation when the seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers began to move around. She leaned back and looked out again. Somewhere below, endless miles of wilderness stretched beneath the plane, rivers twisting like silver lines, peaks fading into mist. She thought about how quiet it must be down there, how far away it all felt from the noise of her old world. Briefings, checklists, the rush of takeoffs. Her career had been everything once. She'd earned her call sign, Hawk, not because she was loud or aggressive, but because of her precision. She saw everything, small details that others missed, split-second changes in the sky that could mean the difference between a safe flight and a dangerous one. But that life had slowed now. Not ended, just paused. The passenger beside her pulled out a snack and offered her one. "Granola bar?" She smiled. "Thanks, I'm good." He shrugged, then went back to his music. It was quiet again, peaceful, But peaceful never lasted long in her life. About 30 minutes into the flight, a small jolt ran through the plane. Not much, just enough to make a few passengers glance up. Alyssa didn't move. She'd flown through storms that could shake the bones of a jet. This was nothing. Still, she noticed something. The pattern of the turbulence, the tone of the engine shifting slightly. She tilted her head, listening. The intercom clicked again. "Ladies and gentlemen, just a bit of rough air ahead. Shouldn't last long." The captain's voice was calm, but Alyssa picked up a note of tension under it. The kind of careful tone pilots use when they're watching something closely. She glanced out the window again, noticing the light flicker as they passed through a thin cloud layer. She wasn't worried, but her senses sharpened anyway. Old habits. A few minutes later, the flight steadied again. The air smoothed out. People relaxed, laughing softly, ordering drinks. The man beside her said, "Guess that was nothing." "Yeah," she replied. Nothing, but she kept her gaze fixed on the horizon. The way the clouds were forming ahead told her they'd be flying close to some restricted airspace, probably the edge of a training corridor. She knew that area well. If communication or navigation systems drifted off even a little, it could raise red flags on the radar screens below. She hoped the pilots were paying attention. She reached for her drink and took a slow sip. There was something about being in the air that always made her reflective. Maybe it was the height, the sense of being between worlds. She thought about her first solo flight, the way her hands had trembled slightly as she took off, and how steady they became once the wheels left the ground. The fear had turned into something else. Freedom, focus, trust. That feeling had never really left her. Even now, sitting in seat 20D, surrounded by strangers, she felt it hum quietly in her chest, that love for the sky. The seatbelt sign came back on. The intercom clicked once more. "Folks, we're going to make a slight course change due to some air traffic ahead. Nothing to worry about." Alyssa looked out again. The sun had shifted now, the light dimming slightly as they turned northward. She noticed the angle of the wing, the subtle tilt that told her they were veering farther west than expected. It wasn't unusual, but it caught her attention. She made a small note in her book, heading, altitude, time. Old reflexes. The flight attendants came through again, collecting cups. One of them smiled at her. "You okay, ma'am?" "Fine," she said, smiling back. "Just thinking." "About what?" Alyssa paused, then shrugged lightly. "Clouds." The attendant laughed softly and moved on. She turned her gaze back to the sky. Through the glass, the light shimmered off the wings like a blade. She watched the horizon stretch endlessly ahead, so familiar yet always new. She thought about the missions she'd flown, how sometimes in moments like this, she'd looked down at the same landscape from the cockpit of a jet, feeling that same hum of air pressure against the fuselage. The sky had been her home for so long that even from a passenger seat, she could still read it like a map. The engines droned steadily. Somewhere in the distance, faint contrails curved across the sky, probably another set of aircraft moving through higher airspace. She followed them with her eyes, her mind unconsciously calculating altitude and direction. The man next to her noticed and said, "You really like watching planes, huh?" Alyssa smiled faintly. "I guess I do," he laughed. "You sound like you know what you're looking at." "Maybe a little." He didn't press, and she was glad. Outside, the clouds thickened slightly, the light turning a cool gray. The plane continued its smooth path north, unaware of what lay ahead. The small twist of fate that would soon turn a quiet passenger in seat 20D into the one person who could keep everyone calm when things went wrong. For now, though, she was just another traveler looking out a window, tracing the sky she knew better than anyone else. The hours in the air had passed quietly, almost too quietly. The passengers had settled into their routines, reading, sleeping, or gazing out at the endless layers of clouds. The flight attendants were pushing the drink cart through the aisle again, soft smiles and careful steps in the narrow space. Everything felt normal. Alyssa Turner still sat in seat 20D, calm as ever. She had closed her notebook and was just watching the soft glow of the sky outside. The sun was high now, painting the tops of the clouds in bright white light. The world below looked peaceful, too far away to imagine trouble. But her instincts kept her sharp. Years of flying had trained her to notice small things. She glanced at the engine housing, then at the distant horizon. Something about the light seemed off. It wasn't anything dramatic, just the faint shimmer that came when sunlight reflected off metal far above them. She narrowed her eyes, trying to focus. At first, she thought it was another commercial flight crossing paths. Then she noticed the movement. Too fast, too smooth. 2 dots far off in the distance, closing in from the east. Her stomach tightened. Those weren't airliners. The man beside her was half asleep, earbuds in, tapping his foot to some faint rhythm. Across the aisle, a kid pressed his face to the window, pointing at clouds. No one else had noticed. Alyssa's eyes stayed on those dots, now growing slightly larger. Her mind automatically began counting seconds, estimating distance and altitude. She didn't need instruments, her brain still worked like a radar screen. Meanwhile, in the front of the cabin, the captain's voice came over the speaker again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be making a small course adjustment, should just be temporary. Please stay seated while we confirm with air traffic control." The tone was calm, but Alyssa heard the slight change, the careful edge in his words. Something wasn't right. She checked her watch, noting how long it had been since their last position update. Normally, the cockpit would stay in touch with air traffic control every few minutes, especially in northern airspace. Silence wasn't good. The engines hummed steadily, but she could feel the subtle pitch change, a small shift in speed, maybe altitude. It wasn't panic-worthy, not yet, but she knew what these signs meant. When you fly long enough, you learn that trouble doesn't start with alarms. It starts with silence. The flight attendants paused mid-service, exchanging a look that passengers barely noticed. They got a quiet signal from the cockpit and quickly began securing the galley. Alyssa's instincts kicked in. She wasn't nervous, not yet, but she was alert. She glanced once more out the window. The 2 distant dots were closer now. Their angle confirmed it. They were climbing fast, coming straight toward the airliner's path. She leaned slightly forward, squinting. She could make out faint outlines now, metallic flashes catching the sun. F-22 Raptors. Her breath caught just for a second. Those were her aircraft, not hers now, of course, but familiar all the same. She knew every curve, every movement, every signature maneuver. The way the wings tilted just before leveling off. The way they maintained distance like a mirrored dance. Something serious must have happened for them to be scrambled like that. The man beside her stirred and looked out the window. "Whoa," he said, pulling out an earbud. "Are those fighter jets?" Alyssa didn't answer right away. She didn't want to alarm anyone. She kept her tone even. "Probably just a training exercise," he frowned. "This high up?" She gave a soft shrug. "Could be coincidence." He nodded, half convinced, and turned back to his screen. But she knew better. This was no coincidence. Somewhere, down on the radar scopes at Elmendorf Air Force Base, their flight number must have dropped off communication channels. Maybe a signal failure, maybe a transponder glitch. When a civilian aircraft suddenly stops responding and drifts near restricted zones, it triggers alarms, and when that happens, Raptors are sent to check. Alyssa exhaled slowly, keeping her movements calm. The passengers didn't need to see her worry. She could almost picture the scene at the airbase. The flashing lights, the pilots running to their jets, the roar of afterburners lighting up the runway. It was a routine drill for them, but it always carried risk. She pressed her fingers together, thinking through possibilities. If the communication had dropped, the flight crew was probably working hard to re-establish contact. That meant they were distracted, possibly overwhelmed. The F-22s would attempt visual contact soon. A few rows ahead, someone gasped softly. More passengers were noticing now. Small shadows cutting through the clouds, sleek and fast, circling near the plane's altitude. The murmurs began. "Are those military jets? Why are they so close? What's happening?" Alyssa looked up and saw the concern spreading. The flight attendants were doing their best to stay composed, walking slowly down the aisle, reassuring people. One of them stopped by her row. "Everything okay, ma'am?" Alyssa nodded. "Yes, you're doing fine." The attendant smiled nervously. "They said it's just precautionary." "Good," Alyssa replied softly. "It usually is." Outside, the jets moved closer, sliding into position, one on each side, maintaining perfect formation. The sun gleamed off their gray bodies, their helmets hidden behind tinted visors. Alyssa knew the drill. The lead pilot would be trying to make visual contact with the cockpit, signaling through gentle wing movements. If the airliner's crew didn't respond correctly, the situation could become serious fast. The plane banked, slightly, and she could just see the Raptor's markings through the window. The sight stirred something deep in her chest. Pride, tension, familiarity. She'd flown those same intercept missions before, protecting this same stretch of sky. She remembered how it felt to approach an unresponsive aircraft, how your heartbeat slowed as you read the situation second by second. The training drilled into you every possible outcome. She could almost hear the radio chatter in her head, crisp, calm, efficient. Now she was on the other side of it. Passengers started whispering louder. Someone took out their phone to film. A baby started crying. The cabin, once calm, now buzzed with confusion. The intercom came on again. The captain's voice tried to sound relaxed, but it cracked slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have some company outside. The Air Force is just confirming our position. There's no cause for concern. Please remain seated." That should have reassured people, but it only made them more curious. Heads turned, cameras clicked. Alyssa sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. She watched the jets. She could almost tell who was flying, just by the smoothness of their approach. She leaned slightly, peering through the glass. The lead jet moved closer, not dangerously close, but near enough that she could see the pilot's helmet turned toward the cabin. A flash of sunlight hit the visor, and she felt a strange mix of memories and instinct. She thought about calling for a flight attendant, telling them to inform the captain she understood what was happening, that she could help translate the signals. But she hesitated. Civilians didn't usually get involved. Still, the situation wasn't improving. The F-22 dipped its wings slightly, a clear signal asking the commercial pilot to acknowledge. When there was no reply, it repeated the motion, sharper this time. Alyssa exhaled slowly. The longer this went on, the more likely the military side would assume the crew was unresponsive. That was never good. The man next to her noticed the tension in her face. "You look like you know what's going on," he said quietly. She turned toward him. "It's fine," she said gently. "They're just checking. We probably lost communication for a bit. Happens sometimes." He studied her for a second. "You sound like a pilot," she smiled faintly. "Something like that." The engines held steady, but the air felt heavier now. A quiet weight pressing over everyone. The F-22s held formation, disciplined and patient, waiting for the airliner to signal back. Then suddenly there was a faint beep from the overhead speakers, a static crackle that cut off mid-sound. The passengers barely noticed, but Alyssa did. The plane's communication system had just rebooted. Good. That meant they were working on it. She waited, counting the seconds, another soft click. And then the captain's voice again. "We're speaking with air traffic control now. Just a minor technical glitch, folks. Everything's fine." A wave of relief rippled through the cabin. People clapped quietly, some laughing nervously. The flight attendants exchanged looks of visible relief. Outside, the Raptors held position a little longer, then tilted their wings in acknowledgement, a silent gesture saying, "Understood." But one of them stayed just a bit longer, trailing behind the airliner before peeling away. Alyssa caught sight of it through the window, a graceful roll that felt almost like a salute. She smiled to herself, recognizing the move instantly. It was something only certain pilots used, old squadron habit. The passengers were relaxed again, talking, taking photos of the disappearing jets. The man beside her grinned. "Well, that was exciting, huh?" Alyssa smiled faintly. "Yeah," she said softly. "More than most people realize." She turned back to the window, watching the contrails fade into the blue. Deep inside, her mind was already replaying everything that had happened. The angles, the signals, the near miss. She couldn't help it. Years of training never really left you. The sky looked calm again, but she knew this wasn't over yet. There was still something uneasy about the flight path, the timing, the airspace. Something told her this story in the sky wasn't finished. And soon, seat 20D would no longer be just another seat. The air inside the cabin had settled again, but it wasn't the same kind of calm as before. It was the uneasy quiet that follows after a moment of fear, the kind where everyone pretends to relax but keeps glancing at the windows just in case. The passengers were trying to go back to normal, sipping their drinks, reading, whispering, but you could feel that the mood had shifted. The kids were asking questions their parents didn't quite know how to answer. The crew was moving carefully, trying to smile but still looking toward the cockpit a little too often. Alyssa Turner could feel the tension under the surface. She'd been in enough close calls to recognize it, that invisible hum of nerves that spreads through people even when nothing's visibly wrong. She sat quietly, watching, her notebook still closed on her lap. The 2 fighter jets were gone now, or at least they seemed to be. But she knew the Air Force never truly vanished that quickly. They were out there still, probably circling at a distance, watching. That was standard protocol. Once you had an incident like that, a communication loss and an unexpected intercept, the military didn't just leave. They stayed until the situation was verified stable. She looked out the window again. The light had softened into that pale northern blue that hinted they were getting close to Alaska. The ground below was a mix of snow and shadow, mountains blending into clouds. The man beside her, the one who'd been curious earlier, leaned over slightly. "Think we'll see them again?" he asked. "Maybe," Alyssa said softly. "Or maybe we won't know they're still there." He raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" She smiled faintly. "They're good at staying unseen when they want to." He laughed a little, thinking she was joking. But she wasn't. Alyssa turned her gaze back to the window. For a few minutes she let herself breathe and just listen. To the low hum of the engines, the soft rattle of cups in the galley, the faint sound of wind against the fuselage. It was almost peaceful again. Then something changed. It was small at first, a flicker of the cabin lights just for a second. Most people didn't even notice, but she did. Her head turned slightly, eyes narrowing. Another flicker followed, and then a brief sound over the intercom. A static pulse that faded quickly. She frowned. That wasn't normal. The pilot's voice came through soon after, calm but tight. "Ladies and gentlemen, we seem to be having a little issue with our internal communication system. Everything's under control, but we ask that everyone remain seated for the moment." Alyssa felt her stomach sink. The communication problem again. She could guess what was happening even before the captain finished speaking. Whatever glitch had cut them off earlier hadn't completely gone away. Maybe it was interference, maybe a system reset that hadn't taken properly. Either way, they were losing touch again. The same chain of events could repeat. The same silence. The same radar confusion. The same response from the airbase. She shifted slightly in her seat, glancing toward the cockpit door. It was closed, of course. A flight attendant stood near it, speaking quietly into a handset. Her expression said enough. They were having trouble making a clear connection. Alyssa's fingers tapped lightly against the notebook on her lap. She could almost feel the rhythm of her old checklists, the way her brain organized situations automatically, step by step, calm and clear. She knew what was coming before anyone else did. The faint roar of engines outside confirmed it. People started noticing again. Someone near the back gasped. Heads turned toward the windows. And there they were. 2 small figures cutting across the sky, approaching fast. The Raptors were back. This time the airliner's crew had no communication at all. The system had gone completely silent. The captain's voice didn't come on again. The attendants stopped pretending to be calm. Alyssa could see the worry on their faces now. The kind of quiet panic that comes when you realize the professionals up front might be out of options. Outside, the F-22s drew closer. They didn't look threatening, not to her. Their flight was disciplined, measured. But to everyone else, it must have looked terrifying. 2 sleek, gray fighters closing in on a passenger plane high above the clouds. The murmurs grew louder. People started asking questions. Why are they back? Is something wrong? What's happening? Alyssa stayed calm. She had to. If she showed even a hint of concern, the fear would spread. The man beside her leaned forward, whispering, "They wouldn't shoot us down or anything, right?" She turned toward him, her voice firm but gentle. "No, they're not here to hurt us. They're here to help make sure we're safe." He looked at her carefully. "You sound like you really know what you're talking about." Alyssa exhaled slowly. "Let's just say I've seen things from their side of the glass." He blinked, then nodded slowly, unsure what she meant but somehow reassured by her tone. Through the window, she could now see the lead Raptor moving closer. It leveled off just a few hundred feet away, its nose perfectly aligned with the airliner's wing. She could see the pilot's helmet again glinting in the sunlight. That sight hit her harder than she expected. She wasn't just watching any military intercept. She was watching her world, the world she had once been part of, now reacting to the aircraft she was inside. She knew exactly what they were doing, every motion, every signal. The lead pilot would be trying to make visual contact, gesturing for a response. If that didn't work, he'd relay data back to command, and command would decide the next step. She also knew the crew up front might be too busy troubleshooting to even look outside right now. That was dangerous. The longer the miscommunication lasted, the higher the risk of misunderstanding. She had seen this kind of situation before during exercises, an unresponsive aircraft being misread as a threat simply because it didn't follow expected procedures. Her heart began to pound, not from fear, but from the weight of knowledge. She couldn't just sit there. She waited until the flight attendant passed by again, still trying to look calm while carrying a phone that wasn't working. Alyssa touched her arm lightly. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "Can I talk to the captain for a moment?" "It's important," the attendant blinked, startled. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but no one's allowed to go to the cockpit." "I understand," Alyssa said, keeping her tone even. "But tell him this. Someone in seat 20D might be able to help. Just tell him that, please." The attendant hesitated, clearly unsure. "Ma'am, we're trained to—" "I know," Alyssa interrupted gently. "But trust me, he'll want to hear this. Tell him my call sign is Hawk. He'll understand." The attendant looked confused. "You're what?" "Just say it exactly like that. Call sign Hawk, seat 20D. Her voice was calm but firm, the kind of tone that carried authority without raising volume. The attendant finally nodded and hurried toward the front. Alyssa sat back and waited, her pulse steady, eyes on the window. Outside, the Raptor shifted its angle again, closer now, scanning. The sunlight gleamed off its canopy. For a second, she imagined locking eyes with the pilot inside. Someone young, maybe, but skilled, focused, trained to make impossible decisions under pressure. She had been that person once. A minute passed, then two. Finally, the cockpit door opened slightly and the flight attendant returned. Her eyes were wide. "The captain wants to speak with you," she said softly. Alyssa nodded, unbuckled her seatbelt, and stood. Every head in her row turned toward her as she made her way forward. The aisle felt narrower than usual, the air heavier. She reached the cockpit, ducked slightly, and stepped inside. The door closed behind her. The two pilots turned from their instruments to look at her. The captain looked tired, sweat forming at his temple. The co-pilot's hands hovered over the controls. Both men looked surprised to see her in a flight jacket, calm and collected. "I'm Captain Alyssa Turner, United States Air Force," she said simply. "Call sign Hawk. You're currently being intercepted by two F-22 Raptors. They're trying to confirm you're not a threat. You've lost communication, and they're waiting for a response signal. If we don't act soon, this could escalate." The captain stared at her. You're Air Force?" "Was," she corrected softly. "Now I'm a passenger. But right now you need someone who speaks their language. Let me help you." He nodded, relief mixing with disbelief. "We can't get comms up." "We've tried every frequency." "Then we'll use what we can," she said, leaning closer. "Manual signals, lights, wing dips. I know what they're looking for. Let's talk to them the old-fashioned way." Outside, the Raptors held formation, still waiting. Inside, seat 20D was now empty, but the woman who had sat there was standing where she belonged again, in a cockpit reading the sky. She took a steady breath and looked out through the front glass, eyes narrowing in focus. "All right," she said quietly. "Let's tell them we're friendly." And for the first time that day, the cabin of the passenger plane felt like the place she was meant to be. The cockpit was quiet except for the steady sound of the engines and the faint buzz of instruments. The two pilots watched the woman who had just stepped in from the cabin, unsure whether to question her or simply listen. Alyssa Turner stood behind their seats, calm but alert. She could read everything from a single glance: the blinking lights on the panels, the warning messages on the small display, the navigation screen showing a faint red border marking restricted airspace ahead. "Your comms are still down?" she asked. The captain nodded quickly. "Yes, we've got partial contact with ATC, but the main transmitter is looping. We can't send or receive clear signals." "And the F-22's out there?" she said, leaning forward slightly. "They've been holding position," the co-pilot answered. "I think they're waiting for us to respond somehow." Alyssa nodded. "They are. But they don't wait forever. We need to give them a clear sign that this aircraft is under control." The captain frowned. "How? We can't talk to them." She looked out through the front window at the bright shape of the fighter just ahead. "We don't need to talk. There are other ways." She reached for the overhead panel, pointing. "Landing lights. Switch them to steady on, then double flash." The captain hesitated but obeyed. "Like this?" "Yes, that's a recognition signal. It means we acknowledge their presence." He did it. The lights blinked twice. Outside, one of the Raptors tilted slightly to one side, a subtle roll that looked almost like a nod. "They saw it," Alyssa said softly. For a moment, no one spoke. The two men stared at her, clearly in awe. "Who are you exactly?" the co-pilot asked. She smiled faintly. "Just someone who's flown a few of those before." He blinked. "You're a fighter pilot?" "Was," she said, her voice quiet. "A while ago." The captain exhaled. "Well, Captain Turner, you just might save us today." Alyssa didn't answer. Her eyes were focused outside, tracking every move of the Raptors. The lead jet was moving closer again, keeping formation perfectly. She could imagine the pilot inside, trying to decide whether to trust what he was seeing. She knew the thought process by heart: check identification, observe behavior, wait for visual cues. Every step mattered. The co-pilot adjusted their heading slightly, keeping them level. "We've crossed into controlled airspace again," he said. "Good," Alyssa replied. "That's a sign they might call off the intercept soon, if they're convinced we're not a risk." The captain looked over. "What happens if they're not?" She turned her gaze toward him. "Then they'll stay with us until we land. But if they lose confidence in us, and they might escalate, and we don't want that." Her tone was calm but serious. A few seconds passed in silence. Then, through the thick cockpit glass, a flash of sunlight reflected off the closer jet's canopy. Alyssa leaned forward slightly. The fighter's pilot was signaling, a short, sharp wing dip to the left. Then another. "They're trying to make contact," she said. "They want confirmation of our route." The captain frowned. "And we can't reply." "Yes, we can," she said. "Roll slightly to the left, then back level. Slow, controlled movement. That's acknowledgement." He did it, hands steady on the yoke. The plane banked just enough for the sunlight to shift across its wings, then leveled off again. The F-22 held steady for a few seconds, then dipped its wings once more. Slower this time, more like a gesture of understanding. Alyssa felt a small breath of relief leave her chest. "Good. They got it." The co-pilot grinned nervously. "How do you even know all this?" She smiled faintly. "Old habits. When you spend enough time in the sky, you learn the language it speaks." The captain nodded, half in disbelief. "You sure know how to keep your cool." Alyssa didn't answer right away. She was watching the Raptors again, studying their movements. Then something unexpected happened. The second fighter pulled slightly closer to the left side of the cockpit. Its nose lined up almost perfectly with their wingtip, and for a moment, Alyssa could see straight into the canopy. She froze. The sunlight hit the glass just right, and through that small reflection, she recognized the markings on the helmet. A familiar squadron insignia. Her mind went back years, to long nights on the base, to shared missions, briefings, call signs exchanged over static-filled radios. She whispered under her breath almost to herself, "No way." The captain looked at her, What is it? I know that pilot, she said softly. He was in my old squadron. Her heart gave a quick, strange beat. The call sign flashed in her mind. She had flown with him before. He was younger then, but he'd been sharp, precise, reliable. If he was out there now, it meant he was leading the intercept. That realization changed everything. If she could reach him, if he knew she was on this flight, he'd trust her word instantly. That could clear the situation within seconds, but how to tell him, she thought quickly. There was no open communication. She needed a visual cue that only someone who'd trained with her would recognize. Her gaze flicked to the light controls again. Captain, can you flash the landing lights twice, then hold steady for 5 seconds? Why? He asked. Because it's how my old squadron used to signal friendly aircraft when comms were cut. It's not standard. Only a few of us used it. He'll understand. The captain didn't hesitate. He reached up and did as she asked. The lights blinked twice, paused, then stayed on. Outside, the F-22 froze mid-air for a moment, holding its position. Then suddenly, it rocked its wings twice and pulled slightly upward, almost like a salute. Alyssa smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. He knows, she said softly. He knows it's me. The two pilots exchanged amazed glances. You mean he recognized you? Yes, she said, still watching the jet. And now they'll stand down. Seconds later, the lead Raptor adjusted its course slightly, pulling ahead of the airliner. It was a protective move now, not an intercept. The second jet fell back, taking up a formation behind them. Alyssa exhaled deeply for the first time in what felt like hours. That's it, she said quietly. They're guiding us home. The captain turned, his shoulders finally relaxing. You just did something incredible. You turned a military intercept into an escort. Alyssa smiled softly. I just spoke their language. Outside, the F-22 stayed close, one ahead and one behind, their sleek shapes gliding through the thin air. The passengers back in the cabin could see them again, this time not as a threat, but as guardians leading them safely through the sky. Down in the cabin, whispers filled the rows. People were taking photos, some smiling now. The fear had shifted into awe. A flight that had once been routine was now unforgettable. Back in the cockpit, Alyssa stayed quiet. She watched the sky, the glint of sunlight on the fighters, the faint streaks of contrails curving ahead. The captain looked at her. You should probably tell me your full story when we land. She chuckled softly. Maybe someday. He nodded. You've got quite a calm about you. I think everyone back there felt it too. Alyssa didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon. There was something peaceful about the way the sky stretched endlessly ahead, clean, open, and quiet. Minutes passed like that. Eventually, the intercom light blinked. The co-pilot spoke into the backup line and finally got a clear signal through. A voice on the other end, calm, official, that came through the speakers. Flight 307, this is Anchorage Control. You are back in range. We've confirmed escort by Elmendorf Raptors. Maintain current altitude. You're clear to continue. The captain smiled, relief clear in his voice. Copy that, Anchorage. We have visual escort, thank you. When he set the handset down, he turned to Alyssa again. They're taking us all the way in. She nodded. They'll stay with us until touchdown. Standard protocol after a silent intercept. The co-pilot laughed nervously. Guess we're in good hands. You are, she said simply. The best hands there are. As the aircraft began its gradual descent, Alyssa looked out the front window one last time. The lead Raptor dipped low, circling gracefully before leveling out again. That small motion carried a message, one only she would understand. Respect. Recognition. She smiled faintly, eyes glistening just a little. For years she had been Hawk, a name earned through countless hours of precision flying, through discipline and courage. Now, miles above the earth, that call sign had done something simple but powerful. It had reminded two worlds to trust each other again. The hum of the engines filled the silence, steady and sure. Below, the snowy peaks of Alaska began to appear, glimmering under the pale sunlight. The city waited quietly beneath them, the runway stretching out like a welcome home. Alyssa rested her hand on the back of the captain's seat, her voice soft. "Let's bring her in." And together, they guided the plane safely toward the ground, with two guardians in the sky above them, a reminder that sometimes the past finds you just when the world needs your calm the most. The sky over Anchorage was pale gold as the sun began to sink behind the mountains. The plane was descending now, the soft hum of the engines filling the cabin like a steady heartbeat. After hours of tension, the passengers could finally feel it. The end was near. Outside, the two F-22 jets still flew alongside them, one slightly ahead and the other a little behind. Their silver bodies caught the light, moving gracefully through the air. To the people watching from the windows, they looked like protectors. Inside the cabin, whispers moved from row to row. Everyone knew something serious had happened, though few understood exactly what. Some had tears in their eyes, others smiled nervously, and a few were simply quiet, holding on to the moment. Alyssa Turner sat back in her seat again, in the same place she had started, 20D. The adrenaline had faded, replaced by a calm tiredness. The man next to her looked at her with a mix of respect and curiosity. "You were up there with the pilots, weren't you?" he asked softly. She smiled a little. "Yes, for a bit. Are you the reason those jets aren't chasing us anymore?" She didn't answer directly. Let's just say they understood we weren't the problem. He looked at her for a moment, then nodded quietly. "Whoever you are, thank you." Alyssa turned her gaze back to the window. The lead fighter tilted slightly as if in acknowledgement. She smiled faintly. The cabin lights dimmed as they began their final approach. The captain's voice came through the speaker, calm now, but thick with emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly at Anchorage International. We want to thank you for your patience today. We know it's been a unique flight. Please remain seated until we come to a full stop." A soft laugh rippled through the cabin. Half relief, half disbelief. Down below, the runway lights stretched out in perfect lines. The snow-covered ground glowed faintly in the fading light. Alyssa watched as the landing gear lowered, the rhythmic thud echoing beneath her feet. The moment the wheels touched down, a gentle cheer rose inside the cabin. Some clapped, others sighed in relief. The engines roared, then slowed, the plane finally rolling safely to a stop. The captain's voice returned. "Welcome to Anchorage. On behalf of the crew and everyone who helped make this flight safe, thank you." No one needed to ask who everyone included. They all knew. Outside, the two F-22s made one last pass overhead. They dipped their wings in a synchronized motion, then rose back into the sky, heading home. The passengers pressed their faces to the windows, watching in awe as the jets disappeared into the golden clouds. Alyssa watched too, her heart full. She knew that gesture. It was the highest sign of respect in the air, a silent salute from one pilot to another. When the plane reached the gate, the passengers began to stand. People were still buzzing with emotion. A few walked past her and paused, giving small nods or quiet thank yous. Somehow word had spread that she had been involved in what happened. The flight attendant smiled at her as she moved toward the exit. One of them whispered, "You really kept everyone calm back there." Alyssa smiled. "You did too." When she stepped into the jet bridge, the cool Alaskan air rushed over her face. It felt grounding, almost cleansing. She looked up and saw two figures waiting near the tarmac window. The F-22 pilots, helmets in hand, still in their flight suits. The taller one raised a hand in greeting. She recognized the posture instantly. It was him, the same pilot she had spotted through the canopy. They didn't speak right away. For a moment, the noise of the airport faded, leaving only the quiet hum of the moment. Then he smiled, shaking his head slightly. "I knew it was you," he said, his voice warm but still carrying that pilot's edge. "I figured you'd recognize the signal," Alyssa replied. "How could I not? Nobody else flashes landing lights like that," he said with a laugh. "When I saw it, I thought, no way, Hawk's on that flight." She smiled. Hearing that old call sign again after all these years felt strange but comforting. The second pilot stepped forward, offering a small nod of respect. It's an honor, ma'am. We didn't expect to be escorting one of our own today. Alyssa shook her head modestly. You two did your job perfectly. You handled it the way it's supposed to be handled. Calm, steady, no panic. The taller pilot grinned. Well, once we realized who we were dealing with, that helped. For a moment, they just stood there watching as ground crews moved around the plane, unloading baggage and securing the area. The smell of jet fuel mixed with the crisp winter air. Then the younger pilot asked quietly, "You still flying at all?" She hesitated, then shook her head. Not like before. I left active duty a few years back. I still fly sometimes. Smaller planes, sometimes for training. But not Raptors. He nodded slowly as if understanding more than she said. Once a pilot, always a pilot. Maybe, she said softly. But it's good to see the next generation doing it right. He smiled. We learned from people like you. They stood in silence again. Words didn't seem necessary. The respect in the air was enough, unspoken but unmistakable. Alyssa turned slightly, glancing back at the plane she had just stepped off. Through the window, she could see passengers gathering their things, families hugging, people smiling. It was a scene of quiet relief, the kind that only comes after fear has passed. She took a slow breath. You know, she said softly, up there for a moment I almost forgot I wasn't in that cockpit anymore. The pilot smiled. That's because you never really left it. She looked at him, then smiled back. Maybe you're right. They shook hands, not the formal, rigid handshake of officers, but something warmer, grounded in shared experience. Then the two pilots gave her a crisp nod before heading back toward the restricted area. As they walked away, she heard one of them call over his shoulder, "Take care, Hawk." She didn't turn. She just lifted her hand in quiet acknowledgement. Later, as she walked through the terminal, the scene felt almost surreal. Travelers hurried past, announcements echoed, and life went on as if nothing had happened. Only she knew how close things had come to something far worse, and how thin the line between fear and calm could be. She stopped near a large window overlooking the runway. The city lights glimmered beyond it, and in the distance, a faint streak crossed the sky, maybe another aircraft, maybe one of the same Raptors heading home. Her reflection in the glass looked tired but peaceful. She smiled to herself. She remembered her first solo flight years ago, the sound of the jet engine, the way the ground fell away beneath her, the mixture of fear and freedom. She remembered how her instructor had told her, "You don't fly the plane, you fly the moment." That phrase had stuck with her ever since. And tonight, sitting in seat 20D on a commercial flight, that lesson had come back. She hadn't been at the controls, but she had still flown the moment. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn patch, her old squadron insignia. The edges were frayed, the colors faded. She had carried it for years, a quiet reminder of the skies that once defined her life. She turned it over in her hand, tracing the threads with her thumb. Then she smiled, whispering under her breath, "Still flying." A group of passengers passed by, still talking about the fighter jets. One of them, an older woman, stopped and said, "Miss, you were amazing." "I don't know what you did, but thank you." Alyssa shook her head gently. It wasn't just me. It was everyone, the pilots, the crew, those jets out there. We all did our part. The woman smiled kindly. Still, you kept your head. We all needed that. Alyssa nodded, her eyes soft. Sometimes that's all we can do. When she finally stepped outside the terminal, the cold air wrapped around her again. The runway lights blinked in the distance and a faint roar echoed high above. She looked up one last time, spotting a small glint of light disappearing into the clouds. Somewhere up there, two pilots were heading back to base, the same ones who had once trained under her. She felt proud, not of herself, but of the connection that still lived between those who understood the sky. She took a deep breath, adjusted her bag on her shoulder, and walked toward the quiet glow of the terminal lights. In the stillness, one thought stayed with her, and simple but strong. Sometimes, the world remembers who you are long after you think it's forgotten. And sometimes, sitting in seat 20D is exactly where you're meant to be, until the sky calls your name again.